we jump in today, we just wanted to add a little framing for this episode. Today, we will be talking about neurodivergence and gender identity. We know that this can be a polarizing topic. This episode was recorded several weeks ago. We do not talk about current events, and it is not intended to be a political episode.
Instead, this episode was recorded from the lens of being a neurodivergent person or caring for and with someone who is. Current research tells us that there is a higher overlap between the neurodivergent umbrella and the LGBTQ plus umbrella. Our hope in this episode, like in all of our episodes, is to build understanding, love, and support for neurodivergent people and their wide variety of experiences. We know you love your kid. If questions around gender or sexual identity is something that is coming up for you in your home or for your child, or if and when it does, we hope that this episode helps you have an additional framework, context, and understanding for the conversations in your home. We've gotten a lot of questions about intersectionality of neurodivergence and other identities, realities, and disabilities, from sexuality to mental health to chronic illness and giftedness. It's something that we did not explore as much in season 1, but we really wanted to highlight this intersectionality in season 2 because we know that there is a lot of overlap. We know that neurodivergence does not exist in a vacuum and often impacts other parts of our experience and our identity. So this season, we are actually going to do a number of episodes looking at some points of intersectionality, and we're going to start right here today.
Yeah, so today we're going to kick it off by talking about the intersectionality of neurodivergence and gender identity. Numerous studies and surveys have shown that neurodivergent people are more likely to identify under the LGBTQIA rainbow, I'll just call that the queer umbrella, than neurotypical people. But what is less clear is why this is the case.
Yes, so let's talk about it today. What does the current research show? What are some hypotheses about why this might be true? And how can we incorporate this knowledge into our parenting, into our work with our kids, and in understanding what it means to be neurodivergent affirming? Welcome to Parenting Neurodivergent Humans. I'm Dr. Morgan Beidelman. I am a clinical psychologist, former school psych, former teacher, neurodivergent myself, and parent to 2 humans, one of whom is neurodivergent.
And I'm Brianne Colpitts. I'm a school psychologist turned social coach for twice exceptional kids. I'm a mom to a couple neurodivergent kids and a late realized ADHD human, which means I'm double blessed with autism and ADHD. Thanks for being here. We're so glad you're here. Let's start out by discussing what the current research shows. And spoiler alert, we need more research around this. While existing research and surveys clearly show that neurodivergent people are more likely to identify under the queer umbrella, this is a newer area of research. So as I already spoiled it, we need more research to fully understand what the data is actually showing us.
Yep, and of the research that has been done, a lot of it has been done on specifically the neurodivergence of autism and then that queer umbrella, that overlap.
Right.
So areas of additional study could be some other areas of neurodivergence or kind of like why this might be the case, et cetera. Those things have not yet been explored from a research perspective.
Correct.
Kind of building off of that, from the research that does exist, almost all of it is relying on self-report, meaning that if I am taking a survey or I'm opting into something and the question comes up, do you identify as neurodivergent? And then I say, yes, I myself have decided to disclose that. It's me reporting it. So if someone is neurodivergent but undiagnosed or chooses not to share that information, it might not be captured in the research. So we might not be seeing the full extent to the way that this is showing up for people because some people may be reluctant to report that information for whatever reason.
Or they don't know, right? They don't know
Yeah.
they're neurodivergent. And sometimes these things, these realizations or these information comes in waves. And so sometimes first we learn about our, like gender identity. And then it's like, oh, wait, I also process the world differently in these ways or whatever. Self-report is what it is.
Yes, exactly. I mean, how many people do we know who had diagnoses later in life? Very,
Yep.
very common. Sure.
Yep.
I think it's important to note here before we move on that in the recent past, people, meaning doctors, researchers, often assumed that neurodivergent people, people with physical disabilities, etc., were not interested in or capable of having romantic relationships, which is wild to me and also not true. So for example, I mean there was like very very long periods of times where you didn't teach people who were on the autism spectrum about relationships or anything like that because the belief was like, oh well, they won't ever be romantic or they won't ever have an interest in somebody else romantically, and that is just not true and truly is like changing in the last 20 years.
Thank goodness. Yeah.
About time.
Yeah, so the few data points we do have, let's talk about that. So it seems that transgender and non-binary people are up to 6 times more likely to also have autism. One 2021 study found that autistic individuals and adolescents are approximately 8 times more likely to identify as asexual and other sexuality compared to their non-autistic peers. And in a survey from the Trevor Project of queer youth, nearly 1/3 identified as someone with a disability, and some of the most common disabilities people reported were ADHD, autism, specific learning disabilities, and then co-occurring mental health diagnoses.
You know, Brianne, as we're talking, I'm sitting here thinking, man, if I didn't spend so much time in this work, there might be some words that I don't really have great definitions for and might not know about. Like, what does non binary mean? And I think what we could do here is maybe put resource in the show notes.
I think that's a good idea. Have a little glossary. These terms are really important for people to understand so that if folks are like, yeah, I've heard that, but I don't know what that means, they can check it out there.
Yes, and this language updates all the time. We can use the list of terms as a way to help us. We can also throw the list away and go with our own lived experience if it's somewhere in this in between. That's why we have the queer umbrella.
One thing I really love is Andrea Gibson's work. They are a poet and actually Colorado's poet laureate have a shirt that says my pronouns aren't even invented yet. And that's kind of the vibe here. Let's not have this all or nothing thinking about these categories because the definitions can change as we learn more and understand people more deeply. If you don't quite fit in one of those boxes or you're exploring that, that is all good.
Absolutely. Okay, so what could be some reasons for what's showing up in the data? At the moment, we don't really know. Getting back to what we said earlier about this being a newer area of research, we have a lot to continue to explore here, but there are some common hypotheses that I think might be helpful to at least just put out there, knowing that as people research it more, we will probably see these be refined. We'll probably see new ones come in. We'll probably see some completely thrown out.
Right.
And that is the nature of research. It's a nature of choosing to go down an exploratory path. So please don't take any of this as like the end all be all. In my experience and in my opinion, whenever we have situations like this, we have research that informs practice, meaning my practice or your practice with our clients or practices as parents with our kids. But we also have our experience as parents and as therapists that then say, hey, could we research this some more? So
Right.
what we should see is that this goes both ways, that research informs practice and practices as living, loving humans also then goes back and informs research.
Right.
So one theory that is this idea of radical acceptance. There's this kind of like broad theme of like, I don't fit in. Where is my space in the world? And as they are kind of wrestling with this idea of the spaces that feel right and feel good to them, you can have some people who really, really struggle with that. And at certain points of their lives really struggle with this. This is where we see increased mental health needs, like anxiety and depression, and suicidality, which we'll talk about a little bit more about later. On the flip side of that, as people work through it, or depending on their own personality or profile, they might get closer, faster to this idea of radical acceptance. And radical acceptance is something that we're always looking for in therapy because radical acceptance is right up against self-love and self-acceptance. Once people have, I say once lightly because it ebbs and flows,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It's kind of a
Um,
lifelong journey, that radical acceptance, at least for my lived experience.
yeah, I say the same thing. And I'm like, when you have a moment of it where you're like, I am radically accepting myself right now. Yes, hug yourself. It
Yeah.
might pass, and that's okay. But, this radical acceptance can also lead to more confidence and more comfortability, kind of exploring aspects of yourself. And one of those aspects might be gender identity.
Right. Yep.
Another thing that I see and that is also seen in the research is kind of questioning norms. A lot of neurodivergent people, a lot of times they're out of box thinkers. Thank
Yeah.
goodness, because they push us to innovate, right? And I think we see the same things when questioning norms. They're like, why does it have to be this way? And so there's this strength around questioning those norms, questioning those systems that don't match their lived experience. And often, many of the lived experiences of people who are close to them in their inner peer circle, and they are a little bit more able to notice that, call that out, and push up against it.
A couple episodes ago, we were talking about assets of neurodivergence, and I did a shout out to the teen humans I know who I work with. I think of them when I think about questioning norms. I absolutely love those kids so much. A lot of autistic brains, they want to know why. Back when I worked in schools in professional development, we would sometimes do the 5 whys, where you just keep asking to get to a deeper understanding of why are we doing this thing? And that's to help kids think more critically and develop a deep understanding. And I feel like the teens I work with, when I think about questioning norms, it's like they're always doing the 5 whys. They want to get to the bottom of it, and they're calling BS out on things that are just oppressive, and they're just not buying into that stuff. And yeah, thank all the gods for those kids.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. I feel so thankful for those clients because I learn from them every day and I realize some things that I have just like inherently accepted versus questioned. It is such a gift from them for sure.
Absolutely.
Kind of related is this idea of curiosity. I think they tend to be just a little bit more curious and also they want to know how things work, but they're also very empathetic. It's like they're curious while being deeply empathetic to whatever could be going on for somebody, including themselves, hopefully.
Yeah. Right. And then we have brain wiring. Neurodivergence, gender identity, sexual orientation are hardwired in. So maybe there's a connection here that leads to a higher rate of crossover. We don't know. This is definitely a question that is not well understood and would absolutely benefit from more research. And then there's the question of hormones. Dr. Lawrence Fung, a psychiatrist at Stanford University, studies why people who are trans or non-binary are also more likely to have autism. His hypothesis is that hormones may be a factor, and yeah, we need more research on this to see if this is true. We just need more info.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about research. Was anybody counting the number of times we use that word? Other than my,
Oh, post it on Instagram if you have the final count.
yeah, right? But the reason that we wanted to start there was because I won't speak for Rianne, but I feel like there's a lot that gets thrown around and there's parts of that that are really valuable because especially if it's from somebody's own lived experience. And I also want to make sure that we're anchoring in any research that we do have so that we have two pieces. We have a lived experience and we have what research and data tell us as we work forward in our path as parents and in professionals supporting our neurodivergent kids and youth.
Yeah, we have to anchor ourselves to be able to support our kids in the way that we want. And before we hit record, we were talking about how all of this should be anchored in love.
Yes, we talk a lot about supporting our kids, but I think to be able to support our kids, we have to support ourselves. And as a parent, parents love their kids. And so when or if your child comes home and they tell you something that might trigger something in you, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think the first thing that we want to do is to have some self-compassion. So, if your daughter says like, I really like girls, you might have a reaction that's like, okay, like great. If that's the case for you, then maybe spending just a little bit of time like journaling about that, thinking about it. Did my kid seem nervous? And to me, it was no big deal. If that's the case, is there something that I might want to do? Or do I want to grab some books that we can explore together? Or how can I bring more representation into my home if you feel like that's an area that you want to grow? Or maybe you're like, no, we have a lot of great representation. We feel like there's a lot of example of ways to love like in our home, and we're just going to keep rolling and we're not going to make it a thing. That's okay. And you could also have your daughter come home and say, hey, I really like girls, and it brings up some things for you. And I think most of the time when it brings up something for a parent, it's because of fear. A lot of times it's fear for their child. I'll speak for myself as a parent. I feel like my number one job is to protect you from the things that I can protect you from for as long as I can. And then also sit alongside you in the suck as it happens, so that by the time you're 18, 21, whatever, you know that you are going to get kicked down, because you will in life, but you have a way to get back up. I view those kind of like two sides of a coin as one of my main roles as a parent. So if some information comes into me where I feel like my ability to protect my child is impacted, that could be super triggering.
Yeah.
I want to protect my kid. And so if you're getting an information, and by the way, it could be the queer umbrella, it could be anything though. It could
Right.
be so
Yeah.
many.
I was just thinking about how this could be the same talk we have about receiving the neuropsych eval
Mhm.
information, and just like learning something new about the identity of your people is something that you might need to just marinate on for a minute.
Yeah. So if it's kicking up something for you, take the time to explore that for yourself with a safe other. Maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a community on the internet. It's okay to take a beat to think about that, and then kind of design or figure out like kind of what your path forward is. And I also just like, again, like want to go back to this idea of radical acceptance, because you're not a bad parent if you have fear and anxiety that comes up. You're a parent who loves your kid, and you need to just take a minute and kind of explore that for yourself.
I will also say that if you learn something about your child that challenges one of your values or your beliefs, I am reminded of a book that I read, The Kids Are All Right by Gabrielle and Ben Blair. They are a Mormon family who lives in France. They do content on like renovations and parenting, just all this stuff.
Are they
Design.
from the US and then moved to
They're from
France?
the US. Yep. The whole book is amazing. And as a neurodivergent parent, raising neurodivergent kids, I found a lot of value in that book. But my point of bringing it up is that there's one chapter around if you choose to leave the faith. And it's like a letter to their kids saying, I will always choose you over the church. It's so
Ah,
beautiful. And I think just keeping your connection with your kid, if that is a high value for you and you're like, hey, we're going to weather whatever storm comes our way because we are tight, we have, a bond, we're connected. I think, again, anchored in love, you can get through this. If you're the parent who's like, oh, cool, cool, and you're like, wait, that's not me. This is not cool. I don't know what to do with this. I think if you can keep your connection with your child as the highest value, top priority, you're going to figure it out. And you might need
yeah.
help from somebody, and that's okay.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And also it could be faith, it could be politics, like it could be so many things.
Yep.
But I love this idea of just like, whoa, back up and anchor this whole thing in love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Got me a little.
Okay, so what does this mean for us and our kids? How can we use this knowledge? Give them some space to explore. That would be, a good thing to do. Some neurodivergent kids tend to be into this exploration piece. And I think them bringing it up, particularly to an adult, is showing that this is something they're looking to get some conversational support around, or, just some more deep support around what they're questioning or exploring. And I think that's a great sign if they feel safe enough to bring that up to you. So good job. I always tell parents being the safe person in a kid's life is like, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because you get all the good and the bad. You mostly get all the bad, but that's because you're the safe person. So good job.
So
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. Recommend to just, follow your child's lead. How do you come alongside or behind them to support them on this journey? So Morgan said, get out a journal a little bit. That could be some questions as well. And maybe you don't know the answer. That's okay. Like
Mhm.
you can get help to figure out what this means, and ask your child, how can I support you through this? Or do you need any help from me on this? Like, I think just getting in a conversation and being curious and accepting is the way to posture when it comes to this stuff.
One of my sons, when he was in high school and he came home and he liked someone and he wanted to make origami roses for them. And we spent like all night. And that's visual spatial. And I'm like in the third percentile for visual spatial. And there was a lot of swearing on my end as we tried to make these roses. But it went over really well. And then a couple, I don't know, my timeline might be wrong. This is a long time ago, but let's say it was a couple weeks later, he came back and he was like, what if we decided to have sex? And I was like, oh! We had ordered food and we were waiting to pick it up. And I was like,
I need to eat first. I can't think right now.
yes. And there was this part of me that was like, I've wanted this. This is what I've always wanted because
Yeah.
I wanted him to like be able to talk to me and have these discussions beforehand. And if he was thinking about it to do it in a mindful, planful way. We talked about consent, all the things, right? And then the moment it happened, I was like,
Frozen.
yeah. And I think at one point he realized that I was like having a bit of a moment. And I was like, no, 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 this is not you. I am so glad that we're having this conversation. Just like, give me a minute to get there. I am truly glad we're having this conversation. But it was like, even though I'd done all this preparedness, the moment was still challenging. And I think
Right.
it is because it pushed against a norm that I had as a child about like what you talk about with, an adult or a parent, etc. Even though I had tried very much so to construct something different as a relationship between, my son and myself. So on that note, as we're looking to support our kids, I think something else to really think about is to help build understanding and empathy for themselves and for others. And two concepts that I think are really good at this idea of making sure that our kids have mirrors. So mirrors are people or examples where they can see themselves. Think about it as like representation, right? It's like where they can
Okay.
see themselves and be validated for who they are, for what their interests, right? It's like, oh, like I see myself in this other person. And windows are this idea of like being able to see in and learn more about the experiences of other people so that you can build acceptance and empathy of others. So one is building empathy and acceptance of yourself, and the other is broadening and having acceptance for others.
I'm actually just taking a note and writing that down because I love it so much.
I was somewhere and somebody said it and I wrote it down, but I have terrible notebooks. People are like, do you journal? I'm like, no. But I have tons and tons of notebooks that have one or two random words written in it. And this is one of those.
So for like windows, are we talking about books or movies or like from the culture? Is that the idea? Like to get insight on other people's lived experience so that you can develop that empathy and acceptance that way?
It can absolutely be that. It can also be putting yourselves in community with other people. For example, this past weekend, I was doing some volunteer work in my community, and the people that I was in community with there, right, we're packaging food up, we're delivering it. It was quite clear based upon like stickers and stuff that we had very different opinions on some certain things. And I was like, oh, this is an opportunity for a window because I am able to like be in community with these people, learn about them, have empathy with and for them, despite the fact that we may have some difference of opinion. Like there can still be a window into each other's lives and experiences, and we can still build bridges of empathy and compassion.
I love that.
The other thing that I think is important as we're trying to support our kids in this is as they're getting older and maybe they are teens or and some like older kids, and they're starting kind of really to explore and they want to understand around crushes and attraction and safe boundaries and flirting and kind of all of that, making sure that they have somebody who can be a sounding board for them. And it could be you as a parent, it could be a therapist, it could be a family member, somebody who's chosen family. But sometimes Kids just need that. The number of times that I've had conversations trying to help them figure out, like, do I actually like this person? Well, how do I know when I'm attracted to somebody? It comes up often. We want everybody to be able to have somebody that they can kind of talk through that stuff with.
Yeah. I think on that same wave is to help build and provide safe spaces. Some more data from the Trevor Project survey, they found that just under 2/3, so like 65% of LGBTQIA young people with disabilities reported feeling discriminated against for their actual or perceived disability in the past year. Perhaps this little section needs a trigger warning because I'm going to talk about some things that aren't happy statistics. Unsurprisingly, those who reported experiencing discrimination also reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Queer youth who have ever been diagnosed with autism had over 50% greater odds at attempting suicide in the past year compared with those who have never been diagnosed with autism. That is a very grim statistic. We know that having at least one, but ideally more supportive people who love us for exactly who we are is so important for everyone, but particularly teens. Now, I'm going to give a little plug here for my social groups because I do have some queer teen social groups. If you're hearing this, feel free to reach out because having people like that, it's a resiliency factor, right? Like thinking about the adverse childhood experiences to be able to offset some of those scary things that happen in life. And especially if you're coming from an oppressed and marginalized disability, especially an intersection of multiple oppressed and marginalized identities, having other people who you can connect with who understand you is just, it's a resiliency factor. It's so important. Not to stress you out or freak you out about this if you're a parent listening to this, like, oh my gosh, but I just think representation, thinking about the mirrors and windows, thinking about safe places where your kids can be themselves is just, it's pretty vital.
Yeah, absolutely. And if your child does have an LGBTQIA plus identity or something that they're starting to wonder about for themselves, finding providers who are both neurodivergent and this queer umbrella affirming is incredibly important. It's why we both feel that if you are neurodivergent affirming, you have to also be LGBTQIA plus affirming. We would hate for somebody to not feel safe when they are exploring this, especially with a provider. The Trevor Project survey we mentioned earlier found that LGBTQIA plus young people with a disability who went to therapy and felt that their disability was understood had a 30% lower odds of suicidality attempts compared to those who had a therapist who did not understand their disability. So, real deep, true understanding has the potential to be truly life changing.
Absolutely. If you're looking for more resources and support on these topics, we'll link some on the show notes. We got the Trevor Project. One thing I've used before is the Gender Unicorn and the other resources from the Trans Student Educational Resources.
Can you talk more about that unicorn? Because that unicorn is so cool.
I will. So the Gender Unicorn breaks down this idea of gender and sexuality in different ways. So we've got gender identity, so how you identify, your gender expression, which is how you dress, how you talk, your haircuts, like all that type of thing. You could have a gender expression that's pretty masculine, but identify as feminine. I'm somebody who isn't very, quote, girly, using air quotes here. And so, yeah, just like sussing all that out, figuring all that out, your sex assigned at birth, which has nothing to do with gender, and then who you're physically attracted to and who you are emotionally attracted to. And then on that little worksheet, it's like a number line almost where you can decide like where you're at because a lot of these things are spectrums. I've done it with social groups for kids and it's just a way for them to break these different pieces of identity down. And I think it's a great resource.
Yeah, you shared it with me, and I was like, oh my goodness. I feel like this is such a great tool to help people with that introspection so that they can build awareness and be thinking through it for themselves, especially if they're kind of questioning some of that stuff.
Yeah. You just even understanding there's these different dynamics within this like umbrella term, right? So yeah, so check out the show notes for that. Also, there are different directories to finding neurodivergent therapists. ndtherapist.com is a good one if you need a therapist who is also living at an intersection of a queer identity and neurodivergent identity. Folks are putting those things about themselves as they feel comfortable on those directories. You can search by state. That's a great place to find a support person if you're not sure where to start.
Thank you for listening today. We'll be back next week talking about misdiagnosis and the difficulty of diagnosis for neurodivergent people. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.
If we are a good fit for you, and if you're a good fit for us, whatever. If we vibe,
It's both ways.
yeah, come hang out with us. Join our communities. We'd love to have you. You can find us on Instagram and YouTube under the same handles. Morgan is at Dr. Morgan Beidelman, and Brianne, that's me, it's Brianne Colpitts.
As always, if you have a question or topic you want to cover, send us a note. That's how we landed on doing this topic today. You can message us on Instagram or use the Google form in the show notes.
Yeah, go ahead and submit that 5-star review on the podcast while you're at it. This episode, as every episode, was edited and produced by Erica Carpenter, who was a total baddie. Thank you, Erica. We love doing this work with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye. I'll take the mic. I do have a mic now in case you didn't notice.
Looks good. You look very official.
Thanks.
Just a quick disclosure, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute a psychological client relationship and should not be used in place of expert evaluation or therapy.
I think my most neurodivergent trait is that I spell neurodivergence wrong every single time, despite the fact that I write it 100 times a day.
That's okay. I wrote a 256-page dissertation that you edited, and I spelled analyze wrong every single time.
That is amazing.